Part two of the Chapter 5 lecture will continue on with our discussion of measurement. Okay, just some terminology. So, measurement instrument. Okay, the instrument is what we are using to collect the data that we want. Okay, so our measurement instrument is just that. What are we using to collect the data that we're interested in? Instrumentation. Um, we look at this definition. A collective term describes all measurement instruments used. So basically, instrumentation is just a general term we use to capture all of our measures that we're conducting in this particular study. Tests, okay, instrument used in educational measurement. So we're trying to establish some increase or decrease in, um, say, knowledge, skills, aptitude, that sort of thing. So test it aligns with probably what your existing definition of a test is. Questionnaire. Okay, so here's your survey instrument. So based on how individuals respond to questions, that data, or in the analysis of that data, is going to allow you to interpret something about the way that the responses kind of aggregate. And scale. Okay, so imagine the questionnaire is the entire questionnaire, a list of all the questions that you're going to ask. It's going to contain different scales or subscales. So, meaning that there's going to be collections of questions that assess a particular construct or variable. So, for example, we may have a demographic scale where we collect things like gender, age, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, that sort of thing. We may have another scale to measure self efficacy. We may have another scale, which would be again a collection of individual questions that work together to measure some construct. So maybe we have a scale, a subscale that measures alcohol consumption behavior, another scale that measures levels of stress. So again, just get familiar with some of the terminology that's used in measurement. Okay, using an existing measurement instrument. Establishing psychometric properties of a new instrument is extremely tedious and challenging. So, if you can find an existing instrument, right, and that has gone through all of those psychometric challenges, um, and depending on accessibility, do you have permission to use it? Is it open source? That sort of thing. My recommendation is always, always, always go with an existing instrument if it serves your particular needs, right? There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Um, After you get more familiar um, with development, then you can venture out into creating your own instruments to fill a need that you may feel is not being addressed with the existing instruments that are available. Okay, so how do you go about selecting an existing instrument? Well, first, you need to get a sense of what instruments are out there. Now, if you go to the FAU library, right, there's a database you can access that you put in some key terms and it's going to return um, basically what instrument it's aware of depending on the data set that's there that may be relevant to what you're trying to do, right? So once you want to get a sense of what instruments are out there, to getting your hands on the instrument, right? So most times when you read a journal article that uses questionnaires and instruments to collect data, uh, very rarely are you going to find that they include the entire set of questions that make up the instrument. Okay, but on the other hand, you may find some instruments that are, published as part of the appendix to the article or something like that. But one thing you will want to take note is in the methodology section, they'll talk about their instrumentation. And most of the existing instruments that have a track record of validity and reliability, there's going to be a formal name. For example, I'm putting together a manuscript where I utilize the DMQSF, okay, and that stands for the sorry, my dog distracted me, but the DMQSF is the Drinking Motivation Questionnaire short form. If I put DMQ-SF into Google Scholar, for example, right, it's going to return all the articles that utilize the DMQ-SF. If I put DMQSF in just regular Google, right, you're going to get all kinds of returns, but one of those links that's returned may be a direct link to the actual questionnaire. Some of these things are more open source than others, so you may be linked to the actual questionnaire, and there may be a passage on how to set it up, how to collect the data, how to analyze the data, if there's any subscales within that particular instrument. But just using a quick Google search can kind of help you see, what's available and what's not. Some things you may have to do some more digging. Other instruments you may need to go to the journal article that kind of reports on this and look for something in the footer that mentions the corresponding author, and then you can reach out to that person and say, hey, look, I'm interested in conducting a study. I've read about your instrument. Would it be permissible for me to utilize that instrument, right? And they can give you permission, or they may not. Number three, is it the right instrument? Psychometric quality used with similar participants, standard or normative scores, culturally appropriate. Right, you're just going to see that, okay, well, I've selected this existing instrument. How well does it meet my particular needs? You may not find a single instrument that matches up to all your needs. You may have to go look for additional existing instruments to supplement kind of what you're trying to do with your particular studies. And then final steps before proceeding: permission, other conditions. So again, getting your hands on the instrument. I kind of mentioned that you may need to reach out to the individual or organization that produced it to see if this is something that they allow other people to use. And they may put some stipulations on that. A common stipulation is that yes, you can use this instrument, but I ask that you share the results of your study with me, because maybe they're putting together a large data set on any instance this instrument was used, or maybe they have other purposes, other conditions. They may say, yeah, you can use my instrument as long as you pay this fee or whatever it is. So you want to make sure that you establish that it's either open access or that you have permission to use that instrument. All right, so maybe you can't find one, or you found one, and that if you were to adapt it, maybe the question says how often do you engage in Pilates? Well, you're not interested in Pilates. You want to alter it and say, how often are you engaged in yoga, right? You want to be cautious when you do make adaptations that you're not doing anything to jeopardize the established validity and reliability. So if you're making big revisions, I would assume, go with the assumption that you probably are impacting established validity and reliability. It may be a better situation where you develop a new instrument, or at least make some attempt to establish that the psychometric properties were not impacted by doing some additional analyses with your revised instrument. But say we want to develop our new one. Right, so we need to come up with a list of questions that are going to produce results that are going to help us evaluate what's going on. So the way that you want to kind of word these in a concise manner that are free of bias. So avoid leading questions. You want to say, when if you have a professor that makes you angry, how angry do you get? you're kind of creating a situation where, okay, well, this professor, must make other people angry, otherwise they wouldn't have asked the question this way. You want to kind of answer it in a way. Does the professor elicit an emotional response? If so, what type of response? Maybe angry is one of the selections. Two-part questions. If you have a two-part question, just ask two separate questions, because the way that person answers one question may influence the way that they are reading the first part of it. And again, you may not get a true or an accurate response in terms of how that question is interpreted. Avoid jargon or the use of words people do not understand, right? That could be a validity problem if they don't understand the meaning of a word, and the assessment kind of hinges on people understanding the meaning of the word. That's going to be problematic. And be specific. Okay, don't be vague, don't be ambiguous. Ask the questions as cut and dry as you can, because that's more likely to produce an accurate response. Okay, we talked about this with data types. Okay, so make sure you're wording the question, asking in a way that returns the data type that you want to work with. Okay, your response options. Again, consider your data types. So we have structured, closed, or selected response items have the least freedom. So basically, you're saying, I'm interested in your answer as long as it fits within the confines of these possible responses. Okay. Uh, Less structured, but still closed, so Likert scale. So you have that neutral, that N in the middle. That's the one that can be a little problematic to deal with. I've seen Likert scale where they just delete the neutral and just have strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree. It doesn't have to be limited to 4 or 5 options. You can go out to 10 or anywhere in between. Multiple choice questions, identify your race, right? You go through the typical census race categories, but then you leave something at the bottom for other. One thing that we're becoming more and more interested in, especially down here in South Florida, there's a lot of diversity, is someone that identifies with 2 or more races, right? So, you can structure the response in a certain way, but if it doesn't fit in with your typical racial categories, you have that other block. Sometimes if they select other, there's room for them to type in kind of what other means to them. And then you have unstructured or open. Had the most freedom. So here's where you kind of let a person comment, kind of free form their answer. What I'll say about that, now we're starting to edge into qualitative research where, that person's comment, that the fact they took time out to enter their comment and express their feelings on that, there's a lot of value in those types of responses. If you're really getting to the heart of the interpretation that person is making. But on the other hand, it can be challenging to use statistics to analyze those types of response. So there's pluses and minuses for everything that you use. Typically, I like to go with structured and less structured, because it just, all your answers are going to fall within a particular range, and that it helps you kind of come up with the appropriate statistical analyses and the interpretation. Okay, presentation. Um, Maybe you're going to deliver a presentation, and you want to make sure that that presentation is received well by others.
The other thing you also want to look at is once you create your survey instrument, how are you formatting it? So imagine we're doing a pencil and paper survey and you've printed it out, you've established what your priority is. When you give that survey to someone, right? They're going to look at it, and the way that the survey is presented to them, there's good ways and there's not so good ways. So you want to have a cover page. Typically, the way that I use a cover page is that's where I put my informed consent information. So basically, I describe the study. I identify any risk associated with participation in the study. I talk about the benefits that this study will bring upon a particular population, and I have a statement at the end. If you agree um, to this, to what you just read, indicate here, and that's basically how I get consent. Okay, then you have a survey title. What's the name of your survey? Okay, if you look in the manuscripts, right, and you look at the measurement section and methodology, right, most of the surveys that describe, there's going to be an official title. Okay, what is your official title? Your purpose statement. Okay, why are you conducting this study? Statement about confidentiality of answers, right? You want to make sure that if you're just interested in the data, you don't necessarily need the person's identifying data, such as their name, student ID number, that sort of thing, right? You want to put a statement. How are these surveys going to be handled? How's the data going to be handled? If it's an anonymous survey or a confidential survey, what protections do I have in place? Instructions for how the respondent should fill out the survey, right? So if you have a short brief statement saying, look, when you consider these questions, here's how you should consider them, here's how you should respond in terms of the format, and based on how they want to respond. Instructions for what respondents are to do with the survey once it's completed. With the shift to online surveys, basically what we're interested in is collecting the survey, getting the data into our database. With online survey, it's pretty automatic, but with a pencil and paper survey, you may have instructions once it's completed. Maybe you insert it into an envelope and place it into the drop box at the front of the room, but whatever it is, or give it to so and so once you complete, or leave it on your desk and then leave the room. Whatever it is you want them to do, well, instruct them how to do that. Okay, the visual appearance of the survey is very important, right? You're asking someone to give up some time, exert some effort to complete these surveys. Um, so you want to kind of take some steps to make it visually appealing. Using a font size where you're not throwing a bunch of words, in a kind of harder to read kind of layout than if you used, you know, big words. Adding spaces in between your survey items again helps the person kind of track and follow along. So some basic guidelines, right? Allow for ample white space. Again, just kind of what I was saying. You don't want it to look very cluttered, but very straightforward. Indent the response item from the question stem, again, so that the person knows exactly what response area they should be working on, or what set of responses go with which question. Bold the question stem. So maybe you have a stem in there that says, you've received recommendations from your doctor to take your medication. Right. The next question: you receive instruction from your doctor to work out. You receive instructions from your doctor to manage your weight. Right. So you received instructions from your doctor. That would be the stem. You bold it just so the person, realize, okay, well, here's the circumstance at which I'm to consider the non-bolded part. Indicate skip patterns. So maybe you have 4 questions, and depending on how they answer question 1 determines whether or not they see question 2 or 3. Or there may be skip logic where, depending on how they answer question 1, they may go automatically to skip over to question 4 because 2 and 3 aren't relevant, or whatever it is. But you want to kind of establish those skip patterns. List all questions and response options vertically from top to bottom. Again, a rule of thumb, but think about how any surveys that you've answered, right? You usually work from top to bottom. Group related questions together. Again, this is a rule of thumb type of thing. You may want to scatter them throughout if you're looking to minimize bias. For example, a person sees that, okay, well, all these questions are kind of related, they're grouped together. I'm in a hurry, I'm just going to do strongly agree for all three. If you kind of scatter them and randomly put them into the survey, um, you're minimizing that possibility from happening. But I mean, it's no guarantee. But again, these are just kind of rule of thumb. Ensure that the survey is designed and coded for easy data entry and analysis. You learn this very quickly after the first couple of times you conduct the survey, and then you go to enter the data into your database. Just different things you can do to make that process a little easier. Use check boxes next to response items. Again, just you can quickly see what needs to be entered, what doesn't need to be entered. Code the response option. So, so maybe you have male and female is your response options. Well, you may enable the, number them 1 and 2, 0 and 1, 500 and 2000, right? It's just a code that you're using in your data set to represent the either male or female, right? Because the data set wants to use numbers. In the, like SPSS or SAS, they want to draw from numbers to run some of the analyses. So you may need to recode your strings, right, the actual words, into a numerical format. Never, and again, there's a caveat there. In most cases, never ask respondents to check all that apply. Rather, have them answer yes or no for each response option. If you're starting out, the yes or no for each option, that may be appropriate. Or if you know ahead of time that, hey, I'm going to use these as my independent variables in a regression analysis. A regression analysis, you don't want to enter in categorical data that has 3 or more responses. You really want to limit it to categorical data that only has 2 responses in the case of yes or no. But you can do some things to accommodate check all that apply. So your coding. You want to make sure that, okay, so if you have 4 responses and you go to recode them, you say, okay, well, I'm just going to code response 1 as 1, 2 as 2, 3 as 3, 4 as 4. Okay, that's perfectly fine unless you have check all that apply. Now, what are you going to do, or how are you going to enter in the data for someone that picks 3 out of the 4? And maybe you say, okay, well, because you need a single value to represent that particular response. And depending on how you code it, right, you may want to say, okay, well, I'll use a number to represent. Maybe I'll just sum them up, right? If they selected 1, 3, and 4, I'll just add 1, 3, 4 together, right, and get 8. That may work. Or what if you have, okay, well, a person selects 1 and 2, I'll enter in a 3. Uh-oh, that's a problem because you've already designated the third option as 3. So that's not going to work. So what you can do is kind of come up with a numbering system. So you have 1 and 2. Then the next option would be 4. And then the fourth option would be, let me do a quick calculation. 1, 2, 4, 7. It would be 8. Right? So now no matter what combination of check all that apply you come up with, it's going to produce a unique number. So if they select one and three, remember three is now a five, you would add those together to get a six. So a six would only apply to individuals that answered option one and option three. Um, if they answered two and three, right? So that would be two plus five. That would be a seven. Seven's a unique number, right? We know that anybody that's coded with a seven, we know that okay, they must have answered response two and three because of how we set up the coding. So there's things you could do to get around it, but probably right now the easiest approach is to, for each possible response, you just have a yes or no question. Okay, so how are you going to sample? Okay, so we have the census. Okay, so it'd be all the participants. A sample, okay, instead of all the entire population, we're only interested in some particular subgroup, right? So our sample is a much smaller number than the entire pool of participants we have to draw from. Okay, sampling unit. Element or set of elements considered to be part of a sample may be individual, organizational, geographic. Again, some type of characteristic that individuals possess that you use to bring them together as a sampling unit. Okay, sampling in general, just the meaning of the word. So, sample is a big part of scientific research because we're looking for some truth within a population, right? And then the idea is that if we sampled every person in the population, then we would know what the truth is. So we is high blood pressure prevalent in this population? Well, if we collected blood pressure from every single person in the population, we would know exactly what the blood pressure, the overall blood pressure is for the group. However, it's often cost and time prohibitive to sample every single individual in a population. So what we do is say, okay, well, we can manage collecting data from, we'll just say 1,000 people, right? Maybe the entire population is 100,000. And what we want to be able to say is that, okay, well, we can collect data from those 1,000 people in our sample, and our results should say something about what's going on in the larger population. We call that generalizability of results. So, but what can be problematic is how you select those 1,000 people. What you want to do is you want to make sure that your sample is representative of the larger population you're trying to say something about. So you want to look for characteristics related to the outcome and how they're distributed in the entire population. You want to make sure that distribution is mirrored in your sample. So if you have, 60% male, 40% female in your population, well, you want to make sure that you have, approximately the same proportion of males and females in your sample. Okay, universe or universal, unspecified by time or place. So it's just, all instances of individuals. Population specified by time or place. So now you're narrowing down from the entire potential population or universe into a defined population. And then other thing you have to consider is your survey population, those who are accessible. So maybe you have a population that you're interested in, college students, but you're only able to collect data from college students on the Boca campus of FAU. So now your survey population takes on additional characteristics of not only being a college student, but attend FAU on the Boca campus. Again, you always have to consider, okay, well, I'm going to get results from this sample. How far can I generalize those results to a larger population? And kind of here's how it goes. So you have your sample, survey, population, universe. Depending on the characteristics and how well they match up with the next level of population, that determines basically what you're working with. Probability sample versus non-probability sample. So probability sample is ideal. So that means that all the characteristics that exist in the larger population, uh, each of those characteristics has an equal chance of showing up in your sample, right? You're not excluding people based on sampling technique or anything like that, right? So it's a usually a true random sample it is conducted in order to collect a probability sample. A non-probability sample, that's probably the more common type of sample that you actually find out there. And because of, again, how you're collecting the sample, you may be excluding certain characteristics from being present. It may be intentional or unintentional. But why would you use a non-probability sample? Mostly it's because of convenience. What's the easiest way to get people to participate in my study is just basically to allow anybody that's interested in to participate. Now, are there certain characteristics that an individual possesses that makes it more likely for them to participate? Well, you're probably going to get the influence of those characteristics in your study results in the data that you collect. For example, volunteers. Okay, why would people volunteer for a study? Maybe you're doing a study to collect some blood biomarker, cholesterol, and you're recruiting people and people volunteer because, oh hey, I had a cholesterol test not long ago, and I'm just curious to see if it's changed, right? Maybe that's their motivation. Maybe they volunteer to participate because their friend talked them into it. Maybe they agreed to participate because this is a study being put on by my professor, and I just want I want to make a good impression on my professor, right? So you don't really have that random assignment, right? It's just convenience. So non-probability samples, typically what you're working with, just know that a non-probability sample makes it very problematic when you're trying to establish causality, because uh, because you're not controlling the characteristics that show up, or you may be biasing which characteristics show up. You may not be able to address for confounding, or confounding are variables that influence the study outcome but aren't necessarily a part of the study themselves. Okay, so probability sampling procedures, different types. So simple random sample, just it's just throw names in a hat, pull the names out. Okay, yeah, everybody has an equal chance or likelihood or probability of being selected. Systematic. So maybe you have a list of names and you say, okay, well, I'm going to select every 10th name. Okay, and you go through it, but there's some type of constant that you're using that's guiding selection. Cluster or area, right? So simple random sampling of groups, not individuals. So you have 150 schools in your school district. Well, I'm just going to randomly select schools. You're not randomly selecting from the entire population of students that are in all of the school districts, right? You're randomly selecting the group of students. Then stratified, so proportional stratified, right? Divide subgroups, and that's your strata, or basically your categories, and select simple random sample from the strata in proportion to the strength of the strata in the population. So maybe you have a racial profile for the population, and the proportion of each race, they're different. So maybe there's 50% Hispanic in the population. Well, in your sample, right, you want to carry over that same proportion. Okay, so you're not randomly selecting people to be part of your study. You're only doing that to a point where you establish the same proportion in your sample that's in the population that you're interested in. Non-proportional stratified divides into strata, okay, and then once you had that proportional, you have 50% Hispanic, 20% white, uh, 20% black, and whatever the remaining area is for other. Um, so you have that strata, and you just randomly select. I'm going to select 10 people from each group. Okay, so again, each has their reasons why you would go that way, and it's you know it's always tied down to convenience and what you're capable of doing. But just understand that you could be introducing selection bias depending on which way you pull your sample together. Okay, so non-probability samples. Okay, so again, randomization is something that you should be aiming for, but the realization is that, or the reality is that that's not always possible. So non-probability samples, when resources are limited, okay, you just can't do that. You're going to do the next best thing and try to come up with a strategy to mimic randomization based on kind of the situation that you're in. Participants can be included on the basis of convenience. When I do surveys, usually the students in my classes are some of the first ones to get those surveys because I have easy access to you guys. I can manage the situation better. Then I may reach out to my colleagues and have them distribute it to students. Maybe I ask for volunteers and always do this, but sometimes I may offer extra credit for participation. It just depends on the situation that I'm in. So, what are limitations with non-probability samples? Kind of talked about this as we go along. Um, Results can be generalized to the total survey population, but not necessarily the population that you're interested in. So, okay, so I collect a sample and I survey from that sample members from Boca Raton. And based on their responses, I want to say something about all the other people that also live in Boca Raton. With non-probability samples, sometimes you limit your ability to be able to generalize to that extent. And then bias simply is something that is just a part of data collection. You have to be able to recognize where instances of biases occur, and at least put forth effort to minimize the chance of introducing bias. Okay, convenient sampling. So again, it's just like that. This population is convenient for me to access and to get data from. Homogeneous sampling, so there's a particular characteristic that you're interested in, so you want to make part of your inclusion criteria that individuals have that particular inclusion criteria. For example, if you look at early studies looking at resting metabolic rate, some of the early studies were conducted I think in Norway, and the racial diversity in Norway isn't all that great. And if you look at the description of the sample in the article, it describes basically the overwhelming characteristics that were in that population were young white females between the ages of 20 and 22. Okay, well you can run your analyses and you can say something about resting metabolic rate, but most likely those results are only going to apply to individuals with those same characteristics, right? Um, that's homogeneous. There's not a lot of variability in sample characteristics. Snowball sampling. Okay, so here's an idea. It's kind of like word of mouth. Um, you have someone comes in, participate in your study, and before they leave, say, "Hey, do you think you could send a couple more people my way?" Right? So they go out, tell their friends or co-workers, "Well, hey, there's a study going on. You should participate." Right? And snowballs that your sample numbers increase each time a person that you've sampled refers someone else back to the study. And then quota sampling, basically, you have a quota. I need X number of people that are Asian, right? So you go out and you're looking over all the potential subjects and you identify those that are Asian and you approach them to get them to participate. Okay, once you get that 25, okay, well, what's the next quota that I want? You go out there and you're actively searching. Okay, sample size. Um, do I include 50 people in my study, 150 people? Well, it depends. Your sample size, because of the way that your statistical analyses procedures are run, and remember I mentioned p-value, right? In order for something to be statistically significant, it has to have a p-value of less than or equal to 0.05. Well, that p-value is generated in part due to the number of people that is in the sample, and it also has the number of measures or items and things that you're measuring. Three major considerations when you're trying to determine sample size. The first one is central limit theorem. Okay, groups greater than 30. Your power analysis. Typically, you can run this. There's online calculators, and based on the effect size and the p-value you're going after, um, it will return you. Okay, well, in order to be able to detect p-value at this level, at a minimum, you should have X number of people. And then precision and reliability, a little bit more of a conceptual consideration, but really it's looking at confidence interval or range of possible statistically significant responses would fall into this range. The wider the range, the larger the sample size needs to be. And I've included some resources in the module for to kind of explain these concepts a little bit more. So take a look at those. Okay, so here's what I was talking about with precision reliability. So +1 in your confidence 95% sample size for precision. Okay, so you look down here as your sample size gets larger. Okay, your 95% confidence interval adjusts accordingly. So again, look at those additional resources I put in the module. Okay, pilot testing, right? So here's kind of a trial run. Um, so basically, you've established some guidelines to direct your process, and you try it out on a pilot group. Hopefully, their characteristics in your pilot group kind of matches up to the characteristics in your sample, and you're basically using it to identify any glitches or any what tweaks need or revisions need to be made. Um, you can get a sense for how are they likely to interpret these questions. Are certain words problematic? I've done a couple studies where I've translated an instrument from English into Spanish. So I wanted to pilot test that to make sure that the translations kind of matched up with kind of the way that people speak and have conversations in that language. Use something like Google Translate or something like that. It can get a little clunky in the interpretation. So basically, it's like I said, it's a trial run to help you identify if you need to make some tweaks before, right, you invest all your time and resources into actually collecting the much larger sample. Okay, types of pilot testing. So a preliminary review. So here you have colleagues review the instrument, not the actual sample. This can be problematic. It depends on who you go to review this. If they're very familiar with the health literacy, the tendencies of the sample population, maybe they've conducted numerous studies using a similar population, and say, hey, what I've run into in the past with individuals from this population is XYZ, right? You can do that. A pre-pilot, right? So here's where you take a very minimal number of group from the sample and just kind of run them through the survey real quickly just to see if there's anything that jumps out. and then a full-on pilot test. So here you collect your pilot sample, and you want to make sure that your findings there are generalizable back to the sample population, which means that the distribution and frequency of characteristics are mirrored in both groups. Okay, ethical issues that you may run into, because we're always going to be dealing with people, right? And people have rights, and there's ethical ways of treatment that you have to consider. Okay, you don't want to do any harm to these individuals. So you have HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, right? That's your right to privacy with regard to your medical status, right? Make sure you understand the HIPAA laws, and the HIPAA applies to doctors' offices, hospitals, third-party groups that handle personal health information. Um, if you're dealing with HIPAA level data, you want to make sure that you're doing HIPAA level precautions are in place to protect those people's identity. Voluntary participation, right? Should not be coerced or deceived to participate, right? Participation in the study should not be should not be linked to, like say, if I use my students, I shouldn't say, look, if you don't participate, um, I'm going to kick you out of the class, right? You don't want to do that. You want them to volunteer. Right to discontinue participate. If at any point a person decides, hey, I changed my mind, I don't want to participate anymore, right? They should have that option to get out. Private and sensitive data must be protected. Of course, you don't want someone to kind of share some things that can be later used against them or be stigmatized. So you got to have your protections in place. Maybe making this survey anonymous, right? That may be something, but you always have to have, okay, how are you going to protect this data as part of your IRB or Institutional Review Board proposal. Illegal acts during data collection, in general sense. So maybe you're, asking them to, divulge, information that could incriminate themselves. Again, you want to be kind of cautious about that. The appropriate data analysis. Here you want to make sure that you can enter in data into a statistical software, click some buttons, it's going to run an analysis, right? You want to make sure that you're using the appropriate analysis, and so that you're interpreting the results in the right way. And then you're reporting results. Typically we report results at the group level, meaning that we aggregate all the individual scores, come up with an average, and report it that way. But if you're promising confidentiality, you don't want to report results in a way that compromises that confidentiality.